The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff.
At least since the launch of Sputnik, Americans have worried that our schools are not adequately preparing our children for international competition. In the 1950s, we asked whether we could keep up with the Soviets. And since the 1980s, we have worried that American workers were ill-trained for the international competition that they face. Simultaneously, the federal government's presence in education increased greatly. In what had heretofore been primarily a state and local responsibility. Here to trace this multi-decade process and to discuss its implications is Chester Finn, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Chester Finn, welcome to the University of Maryland and Policy Watch.
It's a pleasure. It's an honor.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. Well, you have spent your professional life largely, not entirely, in the education world. In fact, I think when you were in school, do I remember that you did some classroom teaching?
I read aloud to the third grade class half of it while Miss Sibylla was trying to teach the other half. I was the best reader in my half.
This is wonderful. Well, much of what we're going to talk about today is contained in this book, Chester E. Finn, Jr., Troublemaker, A Personal History of School Reform Since Sputnik. And this is the book, and I'm delighted that we'll be able to talk about it today.
Pleasure. I wish more people were talking about it.
Yeah, well, this is, unfortunately, you should put it on YouTube or something.
There's an idea.
Yeah, there you are. Well, it's interesting. The subtitle is Since Sputnik. And I suppose with the exception of the old Department of Defense impact aid, Sputnik was the first time the federal government seriously got into K-12 education?
That's about right. You could go back to the 19th century with higher ed. But for elementary, secondary, basically the National Defense Education Act after Sputnik, in reaction to Sputnik, was pretty much the beginning.
And we should just, for our audience, when you say higher ed, this is the land-grant colleges and all the aid in the
That's
19th
right.
century.
And then there was some vocational education in the early 20th century. But what we think of as primary and secondary schools were pretty much off the federal radar screen, at least, until the 50s.
Well, in fact, I'm old enough to remember, keep the federal government out of local schools.
And that continued well into the 60s, including the Kennedy-Johnson era.
How was that? What was...
Well, Kennedy proposed a general aid to education, only he was Catholic. And so was that going to include Catholic schools or not? He couldn't get it through. He could get no version of it through. LBJ came in and in 1 year passed what is still the major federal education law, which is known as the Elementary Secondary Education Act of 1965. It's gone through about 7 incarnations since then, and today it's known as the No Child Left Behind Act.
And it's...
Yes.
And it's originally targeted to low-income children.
It was compensatory education to help poor kids become unpoor by getting them to learn more in school.
So we'll get back to this, but the naysayers who said keep the federal government out of this somehow a little bit knew what they were talking about. Let's go back to Sputnik for a second. So set the stage for us. The Russians?
The Russians launched a satellite before we launched a satellite, and Americans were aghast. I mean, this was the depths of the Cold War, and we were already worried about the Russians. And here was this huge technological advance that they had over us. Oh my God, what does that say about American inferiority? That was rapidly translated into our kids don't know enough, our college graduates don't know enough, we must do something about science and math and technology. That's echoing again today too, by the way.
By the way, there's now revisionist history that says Eisenhower wanted the Russians to go first. He slowed down our space program because he wanted to establish the principle of open outer space.
Whoa. Okay.
So the base for education reform, let us note here, comes from a phantom problem.
Be that as it may, the Congress fairly quickly passed something called the National Defense Education Act. So much of federal education policy for 50 years has been in pursuit of something else, not in pursuit of kids knowing more, but actually in pursuit of some national problem. Defense, economy.
In the 80s, trade, competing with the Japanese.
And today, it is the shrinking, flattening world and how other countries are eating our lunch because our kids don't know enough.
Now, why do we have to have that kind of argument? And is it because if it weren't for that, people would be perfectly happy to not learn anything in school?
We have a pretty complacent country when it comes to actually the performance of people's own schools, people's own town schools, own kids' schools. And so you need to upset people in order to get them to change anything. And you need to have some larger cause. Also, there's not a lot of political traction in kids just learning more for the sake of being better educated or knowing more. There's got to be a kind of instrumental, practical, pragmatic, American-style reason for changing something that you're accustomed to.
Now, there's information in that, as the economists say. I must say that many immigrant groups, value education to get ahead. I suppose what it is once you've sort of won the race, why keep training?
Correct. And most people think their own kid's school is actually pretty good. Inner city parents don't think that, but the great American suburban middle class, pretty complacent about its schools.
Now, are they right?
No, they're not right by any reasonable international comparison. I mean, the one thing we've been learning from now 25 years of international tests is that other countries are gaining on us, outstripping us, getting ahead of us in terms of what their kids actually know, and long-term, the quality of their educated workforce. Most suburban middle-class parents are living in a fantasy world, that their kid's school is world-class, everybody's learning plenty, they'll get into a good college, they'll make a good living, they'll compete successfully with the Chinese.
Now, wait a minute. That sounds right.
I don't think it is.
Well, they'll finish school.
Right.
They'll go to college.
Right.
Because the colleges have only now discovered that they can admit people from China and India. So for now, their kids can go to college. What is it, about half the colleges are open admissions or the equivalent of that?
Right.
And until recently, everybody who graduated from college, I'm exaggerating a little bit, gets a job, joins the great American middle class, and for all the complaining, lives pretty well.
And I think you're describing the 60s and the 70s pretty well. I don't think you're describing the 21st century very well, at least as I understand it.
That's as the world will become.
Is becoming. I think we're into a different world competitiveness. But my prior point is that we've always needed an instrumental reason to do anything different in education. Simply changing the schools to have better, happier, more productive schools or smarter kids never washes. Especially when you consider all the reasons why we don't change our education system.
Now that's the middle class, and you made a point of
Yes.
mentioning inner city schools.
Yes.
And euphemisms apart, we're talking about the education of racial minorities, particularly African Americans, and now with a slightly different language issue on top of it, Latinos.
And not trivial number of poor whites in places like Dayton, Ohio, where the east side of town is poor white and the west side of town is poor black, and everybody's poor and everybody has an education grievance.
And where you grew up.
And where I grew up. That's why Dayton is a template in the book and a periodic reference point for me.
Fair enough, fair enough. Well, tell us about inner city schools first, and then we'll talk about how black parents feel about their schools.
Inner city schools, for the most part, in the United States today are a disaster. They're not safe. They don't graduate very many of the people that come into them, at least at the high school level.
These are graduation rates of the 50 and 60%
Or
max.
in Cleveland, Ohio, 30% of ninth graders get a high school diploma 4 years later. The national graduation rate's in the 75% range for everybody, which is not great, but it's stable. It's been around there for a long time. Inner city graduation rates are well below 50% in many places, and above 60% almost nowhere.
I almost don't care about graduation rates because the world is complicated and there are jobs and so forth. But I'm just trying to be a little here. But I'm horrified by the low reading levels of these kids. It's not just that they haven't graduated, right? It's that many of them can't read at the 8th grade level.
Well, of course, you can graduate by reading at the 8th grade level. And so the graduation standards is its own topic. And that applies to the complacent suburban middle class as well. But back to the inner city, a lot of kids are not graduating, and a lot of those who do graduate are very ill-equipped for everything that follows. And they, be it college, be it a job, be it a good job, be it citizenship. And this is in addition, the schools are sort of dangerous, unpleasant places, full in many cases of either apathetic or beginning teachers, led by time-serving bureaucrats, and unpleasantly led by fighting school boards and revolving door superintendents. It's not a pretty picture.
Now, my idealistic liberal friends would take umbrance if I were to say, well, what you just described sounds like American government. How much of this is a schools problem? And we'll talk mostly about schools, but it is striking to me as I look around that America is in a governance disaster across the board.
I agree with that. But it is worse in the inner city schools than in the suburban schools, for example. These systems are more dysfunctional than their suburban counterparts, and their results are worse than their suburban counterparts. So even if the governance problem is generalizable across the education system and across the governance system, I don't think you see a worse example of it than in inner city public education, with a handful of interesting exceptions.
Yeah. Which we'll get to. So we talked about Sputnik and the Defense Act, and we talked a little bit about the Elementary and Secondary School Act, which was targeted towards low-income Americans, although the targeting, as politicians do, spreads the wealth.
Quite a lot. Quite a lot. It spread widely.
Yeah, yeah. But through the 70s and 80s, my impression is, whatever the effort to improve education, to use the dichotomy you've been describing, it's been more towards the middle-class world. The rhetoric was about trade and trying to involve, what the average American child needs, and not so much, well, we have folks at the bottom who are doing really poorly. Is that a way to characterize the 70s and 80s?
Yes and no. At the state level and in the ed schools, there was a whole lot of pushing in the 70s and 80s toward what they would call equity, their version of equal educational opportunity. This could mean things like fiddling with curriculum. It could mean things like after-school programs. There were a whole variety of ways of trying to address the equalizing of educational opportunities.
And this was the financial equity business, too, of spending,
yes,
equalizing
spending equalization, lawsuits about spending equalization in state after state after state. It wasn't so much the achievement gap, as it's now described, got sort of rediscovered around the year 2000. It became the centerpiece of the No Child Left Behind Act, and it became a preoccupation of the early 21st century. But the equity problem, or the inequality problem, as I think it was perceived, was with us through the 70s and the 80s. What changed, the big sort of watershed, was 1983, the so-called Nation at Risk report, which wasn't about either middle class or poor kids. It was about national, again, security. It was about how the world is going to endanger our future if we don't do something about the performance of our schools. And that was pretty much an across-the-board indictment of American schools for producing poorly educated people.
And you were in the Department of Education around then.
I got there a couple years later. That was the first Reagan term. That was Ted Bell as Secretary of Education. I arrived 2 years later with Bill Bennett as Secretary of Education. We were dealing with sort of aftermath of a nation at risk, but I think the country is still dealing with the aftermath of a nation at risk.
For sure. What do you mean by the aftermath?
Well, so we've diagnosed the problem. What do we do about it? We've identified what's wrong, but is there any way to fix it? And is that the federal government's job? And that was a big question. School governance in America, school finance, school governance power in education, is mostly still a state and local phenomenon, though that's been eroding. And the federal role in it is all still a little controversial and a little bit ambivalent.
Well, let's go back. I seem to remember Bill Bennett's tenure as being one where, at least temporarily, he got us thinking education was a state and local responsibility.
He did that in part by being a very effective occupant of the federal bully pulpit.
How was that? That sounds a little bit illogical. But,
no, the Secretary of Education's job is partly to sort of chart a course and set a direction and call attention to for the whole country. And he was very, very good at that. Nobody's ever been better at that. Second part of the Secretary's job is to shape federal policy. Go up on Capitol Hill, negotiate bills, things like that. And of course, the third part is to administer a complex set of programs in a complicated bureaucracy that requires waivers and exceptions and deals cut with
hundreds of programs.
Hundreds of programs.
Some as small as $10 million.
Yes, in Washington terms, tiny. Others with tens of billions of dollars in them. And that's the Secretary's job. Bennett faced a hostile Congress, and there was not much shaping of new federal laws on his watch, at least not that he participated in. Congress didn't want to hear anything from the administration on education.
Well, of course, he had an advantage in this argument, which is these were the days of Graham-Rudman and what we used to think of as large budget deficits, and so there wasn't really a taste for spending much more money.
At the federal level, that's right.
Level.
But a very interesting thing was going on, and he encouraged this, which was governors of states were beginning to take the bit in their mouth with regard to education. I think the single biggest change in American education over the last 30 years is that we no longer entrust it to the educators. Outsiders, namely governors and increasingly mayors, have begun to say, this is my problem and I want to be in charge of it. And no longer this separate governance system that we had created in the late 19th century, where education was deemed far too sacred to be left to be tarnished by politicians.
This is when we had elected boards of education.
And they were, we still do, but when this system was conceived, the idea was that the best and the brightest, leading non-political citizens who had only the public interest in mind, would be on those boards and would be picking those expert superintendents who would be running these non-political systems. Devoid of interest groups, devoid of faction. It was naive, but it was a kind of classic good government populist.
This is right in the middle of the progressive era.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, you get sort of, we look sometimes for fancy explanations for why we have certain institutions, and if you just ask what was happening when these institutions were created, you can sometimes get an answer.
That's correct, and the answer made sense at the time.
So Chicago, New York, Washington, and I don't know how many other places, the mayor says, hey, I tend to get blamed for this anyway, or I care, one or the other, and so I want to run these things.
And where they have been taking them on, they've had a lot more authority, and they've been able to make bolder changes, typically, than an elected school board would ever agree to make. Now, the jury's still out on how effective those changes are in terms of student achievement. But there is no doubt that the politics of an elected school board, especially in the urban setting, are deeply dysfunctional. Almost every city in America.
Well, we'll come back to unions in a minute, but my memory of New York, my hometown, is that the decentralization of the school governance, which was under, I think, John Lindsay,
correct,
neglected to realize that the school teachers' unions could mount a candidate in most of these small districts who would likely win if there was a little organization behind that one candidate.
Exactly. And as these factions and interest groups have gained political power, this old notion of a kind of governance of the best and the brightest, these disinterested civic leaders, it's pretty much gone out the window, again, in urban America. You can see vestiges of it in rural and suburban America still, and it doesn't work badly in those places. But name me a big city where an elected school board is a big success, and I will buy you dinner.
Fair enough. But let's go back. So the governors in the mid-'80s
Yes.
pick up this issue. Now, I'm sure there are all sorts of important substantive reasons. What's the political reason?
Political reason is that the country was being accused of failing its education system, and there was no. And the governors also had a kind of economic development thing for their states going on at the exact same time. And the early governors that sort of took this on were mostly Southern governors, mostly but not entirely. Dick Riley in South Carolina, Bob Graham in Florida. There were a handful of examples. William Winter in Mississippi, as I recall. And they were interested in enriching what had for such a long time been their poor agrarian state. And they were basically being told that in order to have a chance at modernizing their economy and attracting industry, et cetera, they're going to have to do something about their workforce. And if I heard Lamar Alexander say it once, I heard him say it 50 times, maybe 500 times. Better schools mean better jobs for Tennesseans.
Fair enough. Then a guy named George H.W. Bush is running for president, and in the campaign says, I'm going to be the education president.
Yep.
What happened when he was president?
Well, one important thing happened. He convened all the governors in Charlottesville in 1989. But Governor Bill Clinton was primus inter pares among those governors and stayed up burning the midnight oil, which I'm told he liked to do, in Charlottesville until the governors and the White House had agreed on a set of national education goals. This was 1989. These goals appeared in early 1990 in the President's State of the Union message and then in a statement from the National Governors Association. And these set goals as to where the country was supposed to get itself in education by the year 2000. Now, we didn't get there. And the goals were, in retrospect, a little naive. Nevertheless, it's the closest we had ever come as a country to sort of abrogating state sovereignty in the name of a kind of common national education agenda. Even something today, in today's parlance, we'd call national standards. These were called national goals at the time. It was an important historic development.
Under a Republican.
Under a Republican. And he was the first of 3 consecutive presidents over 20 years who wanted to be education presidents. He and 2 Clinton terms and 2 George W. Bush terms makes 20 years of presidents who had education really on their front burner.
So let's jump to, because we don't have a lot of time, No Child Left Behind, which from the outside looks as if it's yet another big step into federal, I won't say control, but a strong federal voice in local education.
Well, it is. It's probably an overreach, and it's probably also badly designed to accomplish its purpose.
Now let's divide that up. Why overreach, and then why badly designed, and do it in just a few minutes.
It's an overreach because it declares, for example, that 100% of all children are going to be proficient in math and reading by the year 2014. There's nobody on the planet that thinks that's really going to happen. It's badly designed because it leaves the definition of proficiency up to the states, and there's no common metric, and yet there's a common prescription for what to do about schools that are not proficient. So it's upside down. It's what they should have done, and what I hope the Congress will still do, is national standards and tests, but then huge state freedom to attain those standards and intervene in their schools as they see fit.
Now, it seems to me that under a Barack Obama presidency and large majorities of Democrats, at least in the beginning, in the House and Senate, it's also a vehicle, an excuse, a reason for directing large amounts of federal money to the states as well.
If the printing presses keep turning and the money keeps getting printed, then I'm sure there will be an increase in education spending. There's been an increase in education spending, however, under Republicans as well. It just hasn't been as big an increase as the Democrats would like. The federal education spending, like education spending in America in general, has gone nowhere but up over the last 50 years.
It's per child.
Per child,
adjusted.
Per child adjusted is roughly tripled since I was a kid in school in Dayton, Ohio in the 50s.
And you're not suggesting that young people learn 3 times as much.
Exactly the problem. You've just identified the central problem in American education, which is that we've been putting a lot in, a lot more in, and not getting a lot more out.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to our second show where you tell us how we put in either the same or more or less amount of money and get more out of it.
I can scarcely wait.
Checker Finn, thank you very much for being with us.
Pleasure.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.